obligatory keyboard bashing scene. And then, of course, she presents in front of a group of very old, white, beardy men. They wouldn't have had this conversation. They're doing it for our benefit. Hello, I'm Dallas Campbell. I am the host of the patented podcast on History Hit. Today, we're going to be looking at films that feature scientific breakthroughs. I'm going to be looking to see kind of how accurate they are. The current war.
Complete system. He can't even power a sewing
But I can
machine.
solve that problem. Instead of again converting the currents to work with a commutator.
Tesla actually used to work for Edison, as we can see in this scene here. Here they are having an argument, deciding whose current's the best.
Look, I have done everything you have asked, but you are making a mistake.
What?
Direct current may be fine for cities when the buildings are close together.
Actually, the interesting thing about this scene is that you kind of get Edison's character. Edison was incredibly driven. He had a big ego. He talked about invention not as a thing that one stumbles upon, which I think is the sort of popular conception of inventing things. For Edison, it was the invention business, and that's the important thing. You know, he would get lots of people around him working. He would trial and error, test things. In fact, when he was inventing the light bulb, Edison tested something like 6,000 different kinds of filament in order to get the right one. He was completely driven.
Did I mention that his system's lethal? You reach out and touch a doorknob or a rail and, well, you become the circuit.
Just to be clear on that point.
So this is Edison kind of engaging in the publicity war here, so talking to journalists. And actually he's talking about another rivalry. He's talking about his rivalry with another inventor, engineer George Westinghouse, who nobody remembers, myself included. I can't remember who George Westinghouse was.
Again.
So this is the Chicago World Fair, and it's one of those moments that in history that kind of, the whole of history has changed. We get this great moment where, you know, it's interesting when we think about inventions and think about, you know, if you were going to do an invention emoji, what would you use? Well, of course, you'd use the light bulb. This is the light bulb moment.
We live in a higher civilization from this day.
Actually, this is a great scene. It's a great scene because it's if you want a scene that symbolizes a eureka moment, then why not have a scene with lots of light bulbs and the flick of a switch? And it was transformative. So having electric light, suddenly it was the end of nighttime. So what makes it a good film, actually? It's not so much the science and the engineering that makes this a good film. It's the personalities involved. It's the difference in how people approach problems. Edison was such an organizer. He was such a businessman. It wasn't just the fact that he had ideas, it's the fact that he could organize himself and actually turn an idea into something workable rather than just kind of pie in the sky. And then Edison rose and was remembered, whereas Tesla was half forgotten and George Westinghouse completely forgotten. That's life. There was a big rivalry. Tesla actually worked for Edison. Tesla came over from Europe, emigrated to America from Europe. He was, as an engineer, ended up working for Edison. And the point about Edison, he didn't like Tesla because he didn't like people to have as good ideas as good as he did. You know, it's funny though, but Tesla's always been the sort of shadowy figure. He's always been the kind of bad boy. He's always been the kind of seen as the kind of rebel and always slightly forgotten in history. But now, of course, it's interesting. You get people like Elon Musk who sort of resurrected the name Tesla. I think to sort of capitalize on that sense of the forgotten, the rebel, somebody who's, you know, a little bit sort of anti-establishment. Poor George Westinghouse. No, I don't really know. I feel really bad now. I'm going to have to look. I'm going to Google him, for example. Sure. But Edison didn't just invent light bulbs. He invented a whole host of things. And throughout his kind of tenure as this great inventor, you see other rivalries. The film camera is a really good example. Edison, we attribute the invention of the film camera, but there was another character who we've completely forgotten, Louis Le Prince, who invented a film camera which was identical to Edison's and did it before Edison. And there's this great conspiracy that because he died in mysterious circumstances, he disappeared on a train journey and never came back, and nobody knew what happened to him. So there's this wonderful conspiracy theory where they think, you know, did Edison bump him off? Did he have him erased from history, like in Back to the Future? So yeah, there's all kinds, you know, rivalry we see, you know, we see a lot in the history of invention and innovation. And that's because people are involved, and people have egos, and people want to be remembered, and yeah, especially when most of them involve Edison in some way or other. Edison's always at kind of the centre of these sorts of things. You know, with my kind of science, technology, engineering hat on, I'm going to give it, blimey, what am I going to, it's good. I think it's a good film. I'm going to give it an 8. First Man. It's a weird kind of film, actually, and I've seen every film about Apollo, and I'll be honest, it's not my favourite one. Although, I'll tell you my favourite thing in this is my friend Ryan Gosling made the spacesuits for this film, some of the spacesuits for this film, and I have one in my house. So it's the scene where they get into the van and they're driven to the launch pad. If you look at the actual footage, you've got Neil Armstrong, you've got Buzz Aldrin, you've got Michael Collins, and you'll notice they're carrying like their oxygen ventilating little suitcase things that pump air into their suits. Michael Collins is also carrying a brown paper bag, like a shopping bag, and like no one knew what the shopping bag was. Why is Michael Collins taking a shopping bag to the moon? And I actually I tweeted Michael Collins before he died a couple of years ago, and I asked him about it. He said, "Oh, I had a fish in it," and he'd been fishing with a guy called God, what was his name? I can't remember his name. The guy who shuts the door of the actual rocket, and they were great fishing buddies, and he caught a fish, a trout, and he gave it to him as he went in the rocket.
20 seconds and counting. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start.
It's again, it's like the moon landing. We talk so much about the moon landing. It's perhaps one of the most, well, it's certainly one of the most important moments in 20th century history. It's one of the most important moments in all of human history. You know, it's the only time we have any example of one species, I mean, I'm talking in the entire universe, one species leaving one planetary body and migrating to another one and coming back. I mean, it's kind of monumental, really, in how profound it is. Got these wonderful shots now of the Saturn V rocket being released, built by Werner von Braun, of course, or designed by Werner von Braun, high-ranking Nazi officer captured during the Second World War, brought over to America to use all his rocket-building experience. Of course, built the V2 that bombed London, and now he and all his German rocket scientists were obsessed about going into space. They were obsessed about going to the moon. In fact, the Saturn V was kind of way overpowered for going to the moon. It was actually, von Braun was actually thinking about it, using it as a Mars rocket. It's a beautiful thing. It's such an iconic image, isn't it? It's such a not just science and technology, but just of the time. 1969, you know, America are waging war in Vietnam, dropping tons of ordnance on Southeast Asia. At the same time, we're going to the moon. You've got all these civil rights protests going on in America as well. You know, it's interesting when you look at this through the lens of late 1960s history, what was going on. I think well, in fairness to Ryan Gosling, I think he gets the character of Neil Armstrong quite well, in that Neil Armstrong was famously a really quiet person. He didn't like the limelight. He wasn't like Buzz Aldrin, who was a real show pony, or became a real show pony. Neil Armstrong was reserved, was quiet, didn't like the limelight, just kind of wasn't interested in that. After he came back from the Apollo 11 mission, he went and became a lecturer at a university in Cincinnati, I think. The thing that people don't know about the space race, people always think Apollo, JFK's famous, we choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, the famous moon speech. This was to beat the Russians. Well, it kind of was. It was part of the space race. We're going to, all right, you've launched the first Yuri Gagarin and you've launched the first people into space. We're going to show you, we're going to go to the moon. But actually, like the year after that, after he made that speech, and I think when was it, 62 or, Kennedy actually sort of went back on himself and said, actually, what we should do, it'd be much better, because we don't really have any money, is because we've got Vietnam going on. Why don't we do it with the Russians and do a joint? It'd be a much better thing. And actually, Kennedy suggested that, and he tried to do that, and it just sort of didn't work out. And of course, Kennedy was assassinated, and the rest is history. But we always forget that, actually, when we talk about the space race, is that it was suggested a cooperative venture to the moon. The interesting thing as well is that for years and years, for decades, nobody knew what the Soviets were doing. We had no evidence of their moon program at all. It was all really, really hush-hush. Of course, the Americans talked about everything, and that you could see it, and here we are. The Soviets built a giant rocket called the N-1, which never flew. I mean, all of them blew up on the launch pad, or in flight. But they had a lunar lander. They had an astronaut ready to go. Alexei Leonov was going to be the first man on the moon. But they just didn't. They had lots of the technology, but the one thing they didn't have is they didn't have the computing power. The reasons the Americans really beat the Soviets to the moon was the Apollo guidance computer. They managed to shrink a computer, which would have been the size of a room back in the sort of mid-60s. They managed to fit it into something about the size of a shoebox. And I think the Apollo guidance computer doesn't really get enough credit for really why the Americans beat the Soviets. It wasn't the rocket, it was the computer. Actually, you know what? I've seen every film about Apollo. I've read every book about Apollo. It's not my favourite film, for various reasons, but it's very accurate. I think it's very accurate, and also the spacesuits look great in it, because my friend Ryan did some of the spacesuits. So I'll give it a 9. I've got to give it a 9, just for sort of accuracy. I'm going to give it a 9. Damn buses. I remember watching this as a kid, actually. I couldn't believe that someone could invent something so peculiar. You'd drop a bomb on water and it would bounce. And of course, the idea behind it was, it's just like, if you skip a stone, you throw a stone across the water and it skips. So why not develop a bomb that did a similar thing, and it could bounce across water and then hit something? A dam, perhaps. It could bust the dam.
220. This is fine. I can see everything. Down a little. 230. Steady. 230. Steady. Down a little. 235. Stand by to pull me out of the seat if I get hit.
It's really interesting how that happens. Again, thinking about Apollo, again, the fact that, okay, right, we've got to get to the moon by the end of the decade. What do we need? It forces you to invent things. It forces you to invent all kinds of new technologies and things that didn't exist before.
5, 235. Oh, God!
Now look at that. It's an amazing thing. The bomb skipping across the water like that.
It's gone! We've done it! We haven't!
Oh no, it's the...
Would you believe a few simple changes in your diet can drastically reduce your joint...
Apparently a few simple changes in your diet can drastically reduce your chances of getting arthritis. Wars are huge drivers of innovation, because suddenly you've got to do something. And so, for example, the Second World War, we saw all kinds of innovation from rocketry, things like the development of the V2 rocket, you know, the atomic bomb, obviously like that, the bouncing bomb, the Enigma code, the cracking of the code, all kinds of area, computing power, all kinds of things we saw condensed into a small amount of time, because you suddenly had that motivation to do it. We suddenly had to do it. You know, solutions to these big problems had to be found. In times of peace, when everything's going smoothly, then, you know, you don't need to innovate as fast as you can. It's only when there's a real problem that suddenly, you know, the accelerator pedal is stepped on. Dam Busters, I haven't seen Dam Busters for a billion years. It's really funny watching it. I like it because it's so old-fashioned and so ridiculous, and everyone talks very properly and clipped voices, and actually looks really cool. Crikey, you know, this is the days before special effects, proper special effects. Everything's kind of models, rear projections, matte paintings, all that kind of stuff. And they did a really good job doing it, and it looks great. I think I'm going to give it a 9. So this is Radioactive. So here we have Marie Curie in her laboratory, and there's lots of shots of Bunsen burners and things. Everyone's looking very serious. I suppose it's kind of interesting stories. Like, was she the first person who was killed by her own invention? Maybe, perhaps.
Gathered from 4 tons of pitch blende. There's more to find, but... Isn't it the most beautiful thing you've ever seen?
It's really interesting. Isn't it the most beautiful thing you've ever seen? It's a really nice scene because you've got this kind of green glow. And there is something sort of rather beautiful and ethereal about that green glow, and she's thinking about it in an aesthetic sense. But of course, the sort of dangers of it are unknown at this point. We have such a fear of radiation because it is sort of invisible and unknown and strange and almost magical. And the film actually captures that quite nicely in that scene. And then, of course, she presents in front of a group of very old, white, beardy men. Again, making the point about science at the time was very much a white, beardy man activity.
We all thought that atoms were finite and stable. Well, it turns out some of them are not. And in their instability, they emit rays. I have called this radioactivity. We are here to tell you that you have fundamentally misunderstood the atom.
It's such a powerful moment because, you know, radioactive, it's such an important part of nature that we'd completely missed, or we just hadn't discovered up until this point. You have misunderstood the atom. That's the thing about science. That's what I love about science, particularly physics. You never get... I think certainly, you know, the beginning, you know, the early 20th century, we thought we'd had physics cracked. We thought we understood everything. But actually, there's always... You can always go deeper. It's like an onion. You can just continuously peel it back. I think we'd kind of thought, right, we've got physics sorted now. Let's do something else. But no, we can go deeper and deeper and deeper.
Lady or a man?
A lady, obviously.
So it's a great story of the discovery of radioactivity. It's also a great story about a woman and women in science generally. Women just, you know, weren't recognised for doing science, and throughout the 20th century were continuously overlooked. People like Rosalind Franklin, Jocelyn Bell Burnell, the discovery of the pulsar, you know, didn't win the Nobel Prize, even though she did the work. I think she always says that she was quite happy she didn't win the Nobel Prize. I think there's a bit of a curse if you win the Nobel Prize. Work dries up quite soon afterwards. It's a specific type of person who becomes a scientist, I think, very often. It's, you know, you've got to put it out there on the line very often sometimes. It's hard work being an academic. There's academics I know. You know, and yeah, we do see quite a lot of, in the sort of history of innovation and invention, we see, I don't know if big egos, but you see very, very driven people, you know, and people who are very driven. That comes with certain baggage. It comes with certain personality traits. Whether it's someone like Edison, who you know, who was quite, you know, a self-publicist and wanted all the credit, You know, it's you know, scientists very much are explorers, and explorers are a certain type of person. You know, it's a certain mindset, and so yeah, you're not going to get very often. You don't just get shy and retiring people inventing things. You do get quite strong personalities of people who are just, you know, just driven, like artists as well. You know, like artists who are just completely driven, completely obsessed by their work. You know, very often are quite interesting characters. It's interesting. It touches on all kinds of interesting points about the nature of discovery and credit and women in science and all those kind of things. So I'm going to give it an 8. The Social Network.
Mark, there is a girl in your art history class. Her name is Stephanie Addis. Do you happen to know if she has a boyfriend?
It's quite, you know, it's difficult to, you can't underestimate just the effect that people like Zuckerberg have had on the course of history. Like just how fundamental things like Facebook and, well, social media generally have changed everything.
Mark?
Yeah, here we go. Lots of, you've got to sprint somewhere in order to do something in a film about invention. You've got to bump into things. You've got to bump into someone carrying lots of papers and then they drop all their papers.
It's supposed to be at 9. You slept yet?
To add something.
What?
Basically, Mark Zuckerberg turned us all into a product. We've become data points. Brilliant. Subtle, but brilliant. Yeah. Obligatory keyboard bashing scene.
Relationship status. Interested in. This is what drives life in college. Are you having sex or aren't you? It's why people take certain classes and sit where they sit and do what they do when at some center, you know, that's what the Facebook is going to be about. People are going to log on because after all the cake and watermelon, there's a chance they're actually going to get laid, meet a girl.
I suppose the thing about Zuckerberg, he understands human nature. It's a really interesting theme. He says, this is what drives people. This is what drives people in college. Are they having sex or are they not having sex? This is why people take certain classes. And that's kind of Facebook for you. That's basically it, understanding how people work.
Right now. Get your laptop out.
Why do we need my laptop?
Because you got emails for everybody at the Phoenix.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's gonna be cool of them that I spammed their
This is
email.
not spam.
No, I know it's not.
Actually, yeah, that's the interesting thing about social media and invention as well. I think you generally think about inventions as happening within brains, people coming up with good ideas. But actually, certainly in the 21st century, what we've realized is that innovation really is accelerated by what goes on between brains when brains are connected. And this, you know, the inventions of the early 20th century are really dominated by that idea of networking. Brains being connected up.
You know, let's go get a drink and celebrate. I'm buying.
It's also kind of the celebration of the nerd, isn't it? They're all in kind of hoodies and t-shirts. You know, it's a change of the image of the inventor from the kind of Victorian inventor of people like Edison and sort of top hats and things. Suddenly we're into the nerd has inherited the earth. I don't think anyone has amassed that amount of power as people, you know, I suppose particularly kind of Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos perhaps. You know, we see these sort of tech entrepreneurs, Bill Gates I suppose in the sort of 1990s. You know, these sort of tech entrepreneurs when they, you know, it's a very different thing than, you know, discovering flight or, you know, or inventing the light bulb. Yes, you invent something, but the amount of wealth that's been generated by things like Facebook is so extraordinary. It's so unbelievably massive. And that's because, you know, the internet and network computers have just so radically transformed how we do everything. And, you know, it's turned us all into data points. We've become the product, and that's a really, really powerful thing. And I think, yeah, I think Facebook's a great example you know, there isn't a better example of just how much power can be generated, how much power, how much wealth can be generated from having a good idea. You know, Facebook has changed elections, it's changed human psychology, it's changed the way we think, it's changed everything in ways that we just couldn't have predicted, and it's made Mark Zuckerberg quite rich. One thing I want to say about these films about inventors is that they paint very, very simplistic pictures of the people, of their characters, because that's what films do. You know, stories rely on drama. That we want easy things to understand. We want goodies and baddies. That's how it works. That's how films works. Unfortunately, it's not how people work. You know, people are much more nuanced and much more complicated than that. And so, for example, you know, Thomas Edison or Mark Zuckerberg, all these people, they're not goodies or baddies. They are sort of complicated people. Films do simplify everything. So, you know, if you ask, is this film accurate? Well, you know, it tells a very broad brushstroke story of stories that are infinitely more complex than what we're presented with. Social network. I'm kind of biased about the social network just because I hate Facebook so much. Even though I'm on it, I hate it, and it just makes me crazy. It's actually a really good film, though. Like, I really like, even if you're not interested in Mark Zuckerberg or just on a film level, I'm going to give it a high. I'll give it an 8. The theory of everything. And there's that scene. We're just starting to see his disability manifest itself as he's walking up the stairs. He suddenly just trips, and we know something's up. It's interesting as a viewer because, of course, we're all so familiar with the Stephen Hawking story watching this film, so we know exactly what's going on, and that's an interesting way of telling the story. It isn't kind of like, wait, what's going on? How is he going to... What's wrong with him? We know what's wrong with him.
Get literally crushed into smaller and smaller space. And at its end point, what are we left with? A space-time...
Space-time. It just sounds sci-fi, doesn't it? It's good. And it is kind of sci-fi. The idea of space-time is a really counterintuitive thing. Understanding the nature of time is a very... We can't understand it on a human level because we haven't evolved to understand time and space. That's why we need mathematics.
Reverse time, and the universe is getting smaller.
All right.
So, what if I reverse the process all the way back to see what happened at the beginning of time itself?
At the beginning of time itself?
Yes. So the universe getting smaller and smaller, getting denser and denser, hotter and...
So this is the bit in this film, it's the sort of exposition bit of the film. It's like, oh crikey, we've got to explain general relativity to the audience, says the executive producer. So we'll have a scene with Stephen Hawking and his girlfriend at the time talking about things that people understand about the universe expanding. So this is what they wouldn't have had this conversation. They're doing it for our benefit. It's really interesting, yeah, so trying to, you know, Stephen Hawking's book, Brief History of Time, is a famous book for it not being read by anyone. Everyone bought a copy of it, but no one read it because it's actually really difficult to read unless you're a physicist, unless you understand the mathematics. But we as non-scientists, we love the ideas behind it. But the problem is when we start to talk about things like general relativity, the nature of time, we can only really conceive them in terms of analogies. And so what happens is you sort of drill deeper and deeper and deeper into an analogy rather than to the actual science. But we love to ask these questions, these fundamental questions. What happens if I fall into a black hole? How did the universe begin? Can we ask the question, what was before the universe? And what Stephen Hawking was really good at was understanding the public appetite for those sorts of questions, the questions that we all asked as kids. And so, you know, Stephen being able to understand how non-scientists think, I think was his greatest gift. Actually, in fact, even more than his work as a black hole physicist. I think his popularization of science. You know, he became a bit like Einstein. He became the poster boy for science, if you like, instantly recognizable in a way that kind of a movie star is instantly recognizable, and that's partly to do with a lot to do with his own personal story, the story of his disability and his, the fact that he overcame such disability and yet still worked and still did what he did, unable to speak, unable to move, completely locked in himself. That's a story that is very powerful. It's a good film. It is a good film. There's quite a lot of sort of those expositional moments on it where it's like, right, we have to explain things to the audience. I'm going to give it a 7.
Thanks for watching this video on the History Hit YouTube channel. You can subscribe right here to make sure you don't miss any of our great films that are coming out. Or if you are a true history fan, check out our special dedicated history channel, historyhit.tv. You're going to love it.